Thank you so much, Kanaljit. So my name is Kolale Spandanyan. I'm the Vice President and Chief Innovation Officer at Children's National Hospital in Washington, D.C. I'm also the Managing Director of Innovation Ventures, which is the commercialization arm of Children's National. And a role that I enjoy tremendously is to be the contact PI for one of the 5 FDA-funded pediatric device consortia, the National Capital Consortium for Pediatric Device Innovation. By background, I'm a mechanical engineer. It's great to be here today on behalf of the hospital criteria workstream members. I had the pleasure of co-chairing the hospital workstream with Dr. Jonathan Davis, who will present himself. John?
Thanks very much, Kolale. It's really been a great pleasure working with you, as always. And I appreciate Kanwalji's his initial remarks, so I won't go back over that again. Something that I'm very passionate about is children and wanting to do better for them. And so certainly I've had a lot of experience in the drug arena, and now happy to focus as well on device development for children. I'm also the Associate Director of our Tufts Clinical Translational Science Award program. And at the FDA, I chair the Neonatal Advisory Committee and I'm a member of the Pediatric Advisory Committee in the Office of Pediatric Therapeutics and the Office of the Commissioner. So this is something that Kolale and I are very passionate about, is trying to develop new devices to help children and improve their outcome. So we're delighted you're all with us today. We welcome your questions and input as we go through the process of what hospitals will really qualify and what people, because hospitals are not just brick and mortar, but the people inside. So Kolale, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, John. We would like to also acknowledge the contribution of the workstream participants, Peter Armstrong, who is on the panel, Matthew Cooper, Chester Coe, Susan Rahman, who is also on this panel, and Michael Adeyamju. For panel discussion, we will be inviting Sue and Peter. And we would love to say a big thank you to the CPAT leads, Kanaljit Singh, Laura Buti, Sarah Speed, and Karen Stem. And a great thank you goes to SHIP-MD Executive Committee, Vasoon Paris, Tara Federici, Jeff Rosenthal, John Davis, and Joseph Sheeran, as well as over 30 members of the coordinating committee that we met with over the past 1 year on a very regular basis. So as you have heard this theme throughout the workshop, the goal of SHIP-MD is to improve public health for children. SHIP-MD is aimed at transforming the pediatric medical device ecosystem by de-risking and accelerating the developmental processes to stimulate investment and innovation in pediatric devices. As an overview, we are in phase 1 of SHIP-MD, which has been the pre-consortium conceptual phase. As I mentioned, we worked over the past 1 year cross work streams, as well as regularly meeting the coordinating committees to ensure that all work streams are well coordinated and that we put forth a nice blueprint and a plan for this workshop that we can add additional input from our audience to further develop this work for framework and value proposition. The phase 2, depending on the go, no go decision for phase at the end of this phase, will focus on a strategic plan that incorporates short, medium, and long-term goals. And then eventually phase 3 will focus on the implementation of SHIP-MD framework as a standalone SHIP-MD entity. So in summary, as Kanwaljit and John mentioned, our task was to come up with a set of criteria for hospitals that would participate in SHIP-MD network. In our very heated and very interesting conversations that we had within our own work stream about this, we came up with a consensus that a hub and spoke model would likely be the best business model that would work for participating hospitals. So in selecting hospitals, considerations go to regional patient and disease-related diversity. We all agreed that hospitals should have certain infrastructure to monitor clinical studies, including having a local IRB and being able to participate and use a central IRB. They should have a solid understanding of conflict of interest and have a conflict of interest committee and at the institutional level, and having a clinical trial management system that could track research participants, billing, and other elements that are necessary to safely and efficiently conduct a clinical trial. So we strongly believe that a CTMS or a similar system would be very important in these hospitals. Hospitals should have an infrastructure to conduct clinical studies. That could include a dedicated space to conducting clinical research, as well as a pool of study coordinators, clinical research coordinators, database management personnel who could work with device sponsors to efficiently collect data according to the protocol for a particular study. Biostatistics and study design support is very important, and it's very important to also understand the uniqueness of conducting device studies and the type of biostatistical models that should be deployed in device studies. And again, this would be a type of work that we expect and anticipate that hospitals would engage in together with the device sponsors. Evidence generation becomes increasingly important in device studies. So having registries and a solid electronic medical record and electronic health records are very important as well. Experience with clinical trial performance metrics, and finally, an administrative structure to manage contracts. We want to reduce the time that it takes to negotiate a contract, and I will elaborate on that in future slides. So to stress test our list of what we thought would be good criteria for hospitals to meet to participate in SHIP-MD network, we ran that by what would device sponsors see as priorities. And this list was generously and kindly provided to us by our good colleagues at OrthoPediatrics. It's the device company who has made its mission to uniquely serve the pediatric population. So they told us that these are some of the elements that a device sponsor would like to see: the ability to enroll eligible subjects in a timely manner, and this is again, by participating hospitals under the hub and spoke model. Meeting timelines outlined in the agreement and the protocol, ability to provide high quality data, verifiable per source documentation, including timely follow-up. And this is why having a clinical trial management system and having personnel, trained personnel such as study coordinators and database managers become so important in participating hospitals. Investigators should be vested in the study and be available for meetings, consultation, and discussion. This is a collaboration and teamwork when it comes to conducting investigational device studies.
Kalali, I think you just need to advance your slide.
Oh, yes, thank you so much. Great. So device sponsor priorities. So, thank you so much, John. So sufficient site staff available for support who are actively engaged in the process, and open to collaboration and brainstorming with sponsor regarding obstacles in enrollment, follow-up, and protocol adherence. So some of the questions that we took into consideration and we would like our audience to think about and engage in the Q&A with us are the following. What are the barriers to conducting device trials? What are the top criteria hospitals must satisfy to participate in the ShipMD ecosystem? And we came up, with this hub and spoke model, and we believe it's a good business model, but we would love to hear from you. Will a hub and spoke model be a good fit? This slide summarizes our assumptions and also kind of stress testing, this hub and spoke model that we believe could serve very well within ShipMD network. So we assume that ShipMD will have a coordinating center that would be responsible to confirm the unmet pediatric device needs, identify candidate pediatric devices that would enter the ShipMD network, and this was already discussed as part of the navigation work stream. Intellectual property provisions, so the rule book, if you will be set at the coordinating center. It's a rule book that participating hospitals will agree to follow. A central IRB is very important. Protocols get approved by central IRB in a more efficient fashion. Elements such as PRN communications and monitoring the progress of hub and spoke entities, collection of metrics to report to various stakeholders, including the Congress. So these type of administrative activities, we assume that would be done by the coordinating center. And most importantly, and our work stream was very firm in making sure that this is an efficient system. So we don't want various agreements such as interinstitutional agreements, clinical trial agreements, material transfer agreements, and so forth, get into, lengthy negotiations, if you will, between sponsors and the hospitals. So we envision pre-approved templates for these type of agreements that, again, sponsors and participating hospitals will agree to in order to participate in the ShipMD network. And we would like to also emphasize that to provide a safe environment for research is really a high bar. And it requires hospitals to have a rock-solid and sophisticated clinical research infrastructure in place. And most top hospitals that have included research and innovation in their mission to better serve patients already have invested in the safe conduct of research. However, most of these hospitals have done so and have developed their infrastructures around drugs and biologics. And so SHIP-MD will ensure that the discipline of medical device development is equally well understood and appreciated by its participating hospitals. And at the same time, we understand that we must ensure that every hospital that serves subspecialty patient populations and is not necessarily in the top 10, 20 best children's hospitals is able to provide a safe environment for pediatric device trials, and therefore participate in the SHIP-MD network. So with this inclusion criterion in mind, again, we recommended the hub and spoke model to ensure equitable inclusion of research subjects and their associated geographic locations. So the bottom line is that we must provide equitable access to device trials for every patient that qualifies, and it is the right thing to do. So the pediatric considerations in terms of age group in device studies are the following. So there are 4 subpopulations of neonates, infants, children, and adolescents, which brings another uniqueness when conducting device trials. So we have to take into consideration, what CDRH has considered as pediatric age group, and we all know that each agency has slightly different perhaps classification, slightly different, but still this classification is not uniform in across all agencies and across governmental agencies, NIH and FDA. So the challenges of pediatric device trials, taking into consideration, again, the subpopulations of pediatrics, according to CDRH, is that in contrast with drug trials, device trials, again, as I mentioned earlier, are poorly understood in most academic sites. So it's important to highlight some of the differences between medical devices and drugs and biologics, as well as differences between the clinical research process as compared to drugs and biologics. So medical device research is important in itself, but it also can be part of an overall biomedical research for combination drug device studies, for example. Medical device research could serve as diagnostic tool, as a diagnostic and testing tool in a drug clinical trials, for example. And by itself, it could be a life-saving option in treating certain health conditions. So examples of medical devices can range from as simple as a Band-Aid to more complex devices such as blood screening instruments that reveal the presence of a disease, or heart stents, implantables that save patients' lives. So adding to this complexity is also the nature of conducting trials in the pediatric population that requires additional considerations, such as the relatively small number of children affected, broad range of device sizes often required, accommodation for growth, and one problem that we see is the off-label use of adult devices. And because it works, because it saves lives, often it has become the norm. It saves lives, but it's not ideal to think that because you can use a device off-label, then you don't need a pediatric version of it. It's the device that has been specifically researched and developed for children with pediatric labeling. So hopefully we can reverse this status quo. Here we demonstrate a side-by-side comparison of drugs versus devices and the phases of clinical trials, just to appreciate the significant difference of conducting trials in drugs versus in devices. So in terms of Code of Federal Regulations, it's 21 CFR 312 for drugs versus 21 CFR 812 for devices. That again, sites should be very well versed in these federal regulations when conducting trials. So the development of medical device follows a very different route, as shown in the side-by-side comparison. So while clinical trials on drugs focus on dose response study, medical device clinical trials give attention to prototype development. Drug development follows an extensive phase 1 through phase 4 process that tests for safety, efficacy, and toxicity, whereas medical device has feasibility / pilot, pivotal, and post-approval study models. So some medical device research involves substantial bench and animal testing for reliability and biocompatibility, like in implants, but there are no studies for toxicity on devices the way that we test that in drugs. Device development is very iterative, and we heard that in the previous session on reimbursement. This was emphasized. So it's not uncommon that a device that enters the study is not the same that eventually gets approved. It will go through several design iterations according to the feedback that is received by the physicians, surgeons, and the iterations don't have to come back for a new trial. But we don't do the same for drugs. We don't change formulation in the midst of a drug trial. I'm pointing out these differences because you must appreciate that the way that institutions are used to conducting trials is only from the viewpoint of drug studies. So imagine how difficult it is to bring an IRB protocol to your IRB, most of whom are drug experts, and trying to explain that, well, we have to change the design and we can't bring it back and open a new trial, right? They're thinking, well, how can that be done? You can't change a drug formulation. So these are, uniqueness of devices that we really hope that SHIP-MD is able to elevate the appreciation and elevate the type of training and education that needs to be in place in hospitals, in sites, in academic medical centers. Another side-by-side comparison of drugs versus devices when it comes to trials, and so this just demonstrates that, again, in devices, we assess risk based on the class of device. So class 1 is controlled the least, class 3 is controlled the most. Class 1 devices are generally, simple devices that pose minimal risk to the users, like a Band-Aid. Most of Class 1 devices are exempt from pre-market notification. They do not need trials. They do not need clinical trials. They can go from bench testing to clearance or be exempt from clearance. A 510K must establish that the device is significantly equivalent to one legally in commercial distribution in the United States. before May 28, 1976, or to a device that has been determined by FDA to be substantially equivalent. In terms of Class 2 devices, most of them require pre-market notification, 510K clearance. Class 2 are devices that pose moderate level of risk, like intravenous administration sets, sutures, things like that. I guess that we saw Olivia, talking to us yesterday for the pump that she has to wear to monitor her blood sugar level. So that would be a Class 2 typically device. And most Class 3 devices, so this is the highest level of risk, and it's a category of medical devices that need the most attention, and I think that SHIP-MD could be very well positioned to welcome Class 3 device sponsors to enter SHIP-MD and find hospitals that could accommodate trials for Class 3 devices that require pre-market approval process, which is very involved, and companies need to collect substantial clinical data to support their claims. So, but what is common between drugs and devices in terms of Code of Federal Regulations and safety is that safeguard of research participants is paramount, is the same for drugs and for devices, and it's regulated. And with this slide, I'm going to transition to John Davis, who is going to take us from this point on, and I'll come back for the Q&A. John?
Great. Thanks, Lali. With pediatric considerations, there are special protections under the law. So when a proposed research study involves children, and the research institution's institutional review board, or in hopefully the case of SHIP-MD, a central IRB, must take into consideration special regulatory requirements that provide additional protection for children. And we think this is really particularly important for the institutions to have a very strong program already with a lot of experience in conducting clinical trials in children, because then they understand the regulatory requirements that exist. And if the proposed research involves FDA-regulated products, such as drugs or devices, then FDA's parallel regulations also apply. So again, let me here. So there's a number of ethical factors as well. There are some children, for instance, that are not with their biologic parents, maybe in foster care, guardianship, or they may be wards of the state. And then you're dealing also with Child Protective Services and their own IRB. It's really, really important for us to enroll children with adequate racial, ethnic, socioeconomic diversity. This is really key. And that's why we really think the hub and the spoke models are particularly important, again, because we want a broad exposure to children, whether it be in urban settings where there are large children's hospitals, but also in rural settings, because there are unique problems attributable to children in those settings, and those are different hospitals that are going to be caring for those children. We want to make sure there's researcher competencies and that researchers are adequately trained and competent to be able to conduct these device trials, and working with sponsors to make sure that they're operating these devices properly especially before they're doing this in children. We want to be sure that there's no barriers to recruitment. And most clinical trials fail because of inadequate recruitment. That is a well-recognized fact. And so we want these institutions that participate to have broad diversity of patients in a variety of subspecialties, and we want to make sure that the barriers to recruiting those patients are really minimal. We know there's going to be a role of compensation to the institutions to conduct these trials, and we think that's going to be very important moving forward. And we also recognize that there's going to need to be commercial sponsorship. So certainly any sponsor who wants to test out a device is going to need to have funding to conduct those clinical studies. And so it's very important for these institutions and SHIP in general to be working with sponsors to make sure there's adequate resources to conduct the trial appropriately. So conclusions and recommendations from our standpoint, we really think it's safety, safety, safety. And we really think that the hospital, group of hospitals is best suited to create a safe environment for medical device development for children. We want these hospitals to have the breadth and depth of infrastructure, experience, and support. And so certainly it would be very easy for us to say, okay, let's take the top 10 children's hospitals in the United States and sign them up, and we're done. That's easy. And we're going to have some more discussion about this during our panel discussion, and Peter Armstrong has some thoughts that he wants to share. But we really adopted the hub and spoke methodology because children's hospitals may not see all the patients that we need to handle. So a perfect example, we have an opioid epidemic. We now have one baby exposed to opioids being born every 15 minutes in the United States. There is a tremendous number of drugs and devices being developed to try to address the opioid withdrawal in these babies. Children's hospitals aren't seeing them. It's only the birth hospitals, unless there's rare occasions that those children have other coexisting morbidities. So it'd be very important if the children's hospital is the spoke, the hub, to have spokes of birthing hospitals that they work with them, because there may be a variety of devices developed for children when they're first born. We also think it's important to have C-suite support and commitment. You need to have senior administrative leaders committed for that institution to participate in this. It's going to be an honor and a privilege for these institutions to participate in this type of an elite network because it does bring a certain amount of expertise and public relations, etc., to your institution, but all the factors have to fit appropriately. We really want to create a dynamic, adaptive, and sustainable national evidence generation infrastructure for pediatric device development. And sustainable is really important. It can only be sustainable if all the other work streams, really their focus is realized. And that's why we're one of 5. And all of these work streams have had significant input. And we can't survive and be successful without all the other work streams and all the other contributors to those work streams and the key stakeholders all contributing to this process. We want streamlined clinical trials that will work safely, generate high-quality data, and be highly efficient, and to be able to incorporate a variety of unique trial designs that will hopefully speed up the clinical trials process. As Kalali mentioned, we want there to be the potential for enterprise-wide electronic health record, real-world evidence, and data management systems contributing to high-quality data. We want ShipMD to function as the coordinating unit for go, no-go, and go-to participating hospitals to work with sponsors in the different phases of their study. We need economies of scale, so there's reduced cost of conducting these studies and reduced timelines. So we want it, again, to be safe and highly efficient. And we know that if we can get you the patients and we can do it in a more streamlined fashion and reduce the headaches for sponsors, that's going to be a success just in of itself. Cost sharing will allow small companies to have the advantage of big technology companies, and really just a single signature contracting to the entire network that gives you an entire system. It gives you a single contracting mechanism and a single IRB process, and a single IRB cannot be discussed enough. Certainly any time that you can have a continuing review that works with one IRB for all the sites, when amendments can go through just once, that really makes a huge difference. So I think I'll stop there and ask our panelists to join us in answering questions.